suspected his maid was stealing from him. For 3 weeks, he watched her sneak out with bags she didn't bring in. So one night, he followed her, ready to catch her in the act. What he discovered left him speechless. Some stories do not begin with love. They begin with blindness. Not the kind cured by glasses or surgery, the kind where a man can see skyscrapers, contracts, numbers, profits, yet fail to see the human heart standing right beside him. This is the story of Andrew Terry, a billionaire who owned half of Chicago, and yet, for 34 years, failed to notice the woman who raised him, the woman who kept his home running, who held his broken childhood together, who loved him when nobody else did. Her name was Elizabeth Hart. He believed she was just a maid. He was wrong. The Terry mansion had 42 rooms, a library with books he never read, a game room with toys he never touched, a dining hall that seated 20, but usually held just one. Andrew learned very young that silence could be loud. Other children had parents who clapped at school awards. He had drivers waiting with engines running. Other children had lunch boxes with notes that said, "Good luck." He had credit cards. He remembered being 5 years old, standing in the hallway. His father walked past him while talking on the phone. "Yes, transfer the funds. No delays. We can't afford emotional decisions." Those were the words Andrew grew up hearing. Not, "I love you." Not, "How was your day?" But, "We cannot afford emotional decisions." So Andrew stopped having emotions. At least, that's what he believed. But there was always one person who refused to let that part of him die. Elizabeth. She didn't just serve meals. She served presents. She tied his shoelaces wrong sometimes and laughed with him while redoing them. She listened when he talked about dinosaurs for an hour straight. She clapped alone at his piano recital when no one else came. He never called her Mom. He never even called her Elizabeth. He called her what the job description said, "Ma'am." And every time he did, a tiny part of her heart bent but did not break. Because love doesn't break easily. It endures. Years reshaped the lonely boy into the type of man newspapers printed proudly. Forbes cover, billionaire at 34, real estate king of Chicago. But articles don't print the truth. They don't print the nights he couldn't sleep without turning on the hallway lights because silence reminded him of childhood. They don't print the way he only dated people who admired him, not people who loved him, because love felt too risky. He learned to replace affection with deals. He learned to replace warmth with power. He learned that if people feared you, they wouldn't leave you. But fear is not company. It is just very expensive loneliness. And in the middle of that cold success, Elizabeth remained in his mansion. She still placed soup beside him when he worked late. She still switched off lights he forgot. She still pressed her hand to his forehead when he looked pale, then pretended it was accidental. He thanked her politely, but he never saw her. He saw her uniform. He saw duties. He saw someone working for him, not someone who had been his entire childhood. Blindness is not the absence of eyes. It is the absence of attention. It began the way many tragedies start, with assumptions. At first, it was just food missing, then blankets, then medicine from the cabinet. He asked the kitchen staff. They shrugged. "Maybe miscounting, sir." But billionaires don't believe in miscounting. Numbers don't lie. So he watched the cameras. He rewound footage. There she was, Elizabeth, carrying bags, heavy, clearly full, out of the side entrance late at night. No permission, no explanation. His mind, trained by business, did what it always did. It calculated. He didn't remember the woman who stayed up when he had nightmares. He remembered salary sheets. He didn't remember the hands that held his when he learned to write. He remembered contracts. "She's stealing," he concluded. And once pride chooses a conclusion, it hunts for proof, not truth. For 3 weeks he watched her, quietly, coldly. He didn't ask. He didn't talk. He just waited to catch her failing. Sometimes we break the people who love us not because they did wrong, but because our hearts forgot gratitude. It was the kind of winter night when Chicago breathed smoke from every rooftop. The roads glittered with frozen air. Breath turned white. Elizabeth left at exactly 9:40 p.m. As always, Andrew followed. He didn't turn music on. He didn't think about safety. He only thought, I trusted her. She betrayed me. The route surprised him. Not downtown, not malls, not even residential comfort. They drove into streets where streetlights flickered and walls carried graffiti instead of paint, where windows were broken before hopes were, where people didn't look at luxury cars. They looked through them. Elizabeth stopped at an old warehouse. He watched her enter. He waited 1 minute. Then he pushed the rusting metal door. Inside was not a thief's hideout. It was a world reality forgot. No laughter, just the sound of soft coughing and tiny feet moving across cold concrete. Children, not one, not two, 12. Their clothes were mismatched and patched in places that shouldn't have needed stitching. Their hair hadn't been cut evenly. Their hands were small and shaking, yet their eyes carried stories cities never read. Elizabeth knelt in the middle of them, pouring soup into cracked bowls, blowing gently so they wouldn't burn their tongues. One boy ran to her the moment she looked up. Grandma Liz. Grandma. The word smashed through the billionaire's chest like light breaking through years of night. A little girl tugged at Elizabeth's sleeve. My reading lesson? Elizabeth smiled and pulled out a worn children's book, its cover taped carefully. Andrew couldn't speak. He had prepared accusations. He had prepared anger. He had prepared punishment. But love disarms rage. What is this? He finally whispered. She said nothing for a moment, just wrapped a scarf tighter around a small child's neck. Then she stood, hands calm, eyes kind. These, she said softly, are children who were forgotten. Elizabeth sat beside him on a wooden crate. Snow spilled through broken window frames. She told the story simply, without drama, without begging for admiration. Some children lost parents in accidents. Some were abandoned. Some ran away from people who hurt them more than the streets ever could. There were no government files, no adoption papers, just lives, lives that needed warmth. So you stole, Andrew said bitterly, not to accuse, but to defend himself from guilt. She looked at him tenderly. I never stole from you, Andrew. I used my life. He didn't understand. My salary, she continued, my hands, my evenings, my prayers, my bones when they ache, those belong to me, and I give them here. He stared at the bags. And the food from my house? He asked. She nodded gently. Sometimes love is bigger than rules. He expected excuses. He received wisdom. He sat down on the floor, expensive suit forgotten, cold cement against his palms. And after years of being a man carved from ice, Andrew Terry did something he hadn't done since childhood. He cried. Not quiet tears, deep, shaking tears that carried decades of loneliness out of his chest. Elizabeth didn't rush to comfort him. She simply placed her hand on his back, the same way she had when he was 8 and cried because no one came to his school play. Some gestures do not age. They just wait until we are ready to understand them. Memories attacked him now. Elizabeth sewing his school badge at midnight so he wouldn't be punished the next day. Elizabeth sitting on hospital chairs while machines beeped. Elizabeth clapping alone, loudly, proudly. The world had called her Maid, but the truth was cruelly simple. She had been his mother in every way except name, and he had paid her with salary instead of gratitude. That realization hurt more than any financial loss ever could. He looked at her through tears. I never asked you if you were happy, he said. She smiled, the kind of smile that forgives without needing apologies. You were a child, she said softly, and children are not supposed to take care of adults. He shook his head. But I am not a child anymore. No, she said, placing a hand on his cheek. You finally grew up tonight. The billionaire who once calculated everything stopped calculating. He served soup with his own hands. He wiped little noses. He listened to stories. Stories without grammar, without structure, yet filled with truth. One boy showed him a drawing, a house with many windows. "That's my dream," he said shyly. "What's inside the house?" Andrew asked. The boy replied, "People who don't leave." Andrew felt something inside his heart reshape itself. He turned to Elizabeth. "How did you manage all this alone?" he asked. She shrugged softly. "Love is not heavy." He looked around, but the children were light, because love carries weight differently. That night, he didn't offer charity speeches. He didn't take photos. He didn't post about generosity. He simply promised himself, "I will not look away again." Weeks followed. Lawyers filed papers. Architects visited the warehouse. Doctors examined the children. A new building rose. Bright windows, warm beds, shelves full of books, walls painted by little hands with big dreams. He called it the Heart Home. Elizabeth protested. "You shouldn't name it after me." He shook his head gently. "I'm not naming it after you," he said. "I'm naming it after the heart I finally found." Children now ran through decorated hallways. They had birthdays. They had school. They had futures. And Andrew had something he had never owned before: family. Not the cold business meetings that masqueraded as dinners, not parties filled with strangers calling him sir. Real family, people who hugged without calculating benefit. The greatest blindness is not in the eyes. It is in the heart that forgets to recognize love. Andrew had money, power, respect, but none of those things tucked him into bed when he was small. A maid did. A woman's society called ordinary turned out to be the person who had held the world together for him without asking for anything. Moral of the story: do not measure people by their job titles. Measure them by the size of their heart. If someone serves you, respect them. They may be quietly saving your life in ways you cannot see. Success is not owning everything. Success is finally seeing the ones who stood beside you when you had nothing. The real poor man is not the one without money. It is the one without gratitude. And above all, never forget the hands that raised you when the world was too big for you to face alone. Because sometimes the person you call just a maid is the one who loved you before the world knew your name. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Share it. Comment what lesson you learned. And subscribe to Momentum Stories for more real stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Your one click can help this message reach someone who really needs it today.